Blackwells Journey. Lady Isabel of Westmere had spent a year outrunning the king's men, but when Sir Gareth Fitzrohan finally caught her, he did not strike. Instead, he tilted his head, watching her. "You are a difficult woman to catch, my lady," he murmured. "Shall we see if you are just as difficult to tame?" Chapter 1. The Falcon and the Fugitive. The wind whipped at Lady Isabel's cloak, a fierce, untamed thing mirroring the turmoil in her heart. A full year, she had evaded the king's relentless pursuit, a wraith flitting through the shadowed valleys and mist-wreathed forests of Westmere. Her once fine gowns were now travel-stained and torn. Her hands, once accustomed to embroidery and the gentle strumming of a lute, were calloused and scarred. But her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, still held their fire, a defiant spark that refused to be quenched. The snapping of a twig underfoot sent a jolt of fear through her. She whirled, her hand instinctively reaching for the small dagger hidden beneath her cloak. It was a pathetic weapon against the might of the king's men, but it was all she had left. Her breath hitched in her throat as a figure emerged from the trees, tall and imposing, silhouetted against the fading light. He was a knight, his armor gleaming dully, the crest of a rampant lion emblazoned on his surcoat, the mark of Fitzrohan. Sir Gareth Fitzrohan, the king's hunter, the man sent to bring her back, to shackle her to a fate she had desperately sought to escape. He did not draw his sword. Instead, he stood there, his gaze unwavering, a strange stillness about him that was more unsettling than any threat. The wind seemed to hold its breath, the forest falling silent around them. Isabel felt a prickle of unease, a sensation that went beyond the immediate danger. This was not the brutal, bloodthirsty warrior she had expected. "You are a difficult woman to catch, my lady," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air she breathed. His eyes, a startling shade of amber, held a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity, nor was it cruelty. It was something far more complex, something that stirred a disquieting awareness within her. Isabel forced herself to meet his gaze, her chin lifting in defiance. "And you are persistent, Sir Knight. To what do I owe this honor?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm, a shield against the fear that threatened to consume her. He took a step closer, the metallic scent of his armor mingling with the damp earth and the pine needles underfoot. "The king commands your return, Lady Isabel. He tires of this game of hide and seek." "It is no game to me," she retorted, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "It is my life." Gareth studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had tracked her across miles of rugged terrain, followed the faintest of trails, outwitted the loyal villagers who had sheltered her. He had expected to find a broken, desperate woman. Instead, he found a fiery spirit, a woman who, despite her exhaustion and fear, held herself with a regal bearing that spoke of her noble lineage. He had heard tales of Lady Isabel of Westmere, of her beauty and her spirit, of her refusal to wed the aging, cruel Duke of Northwood, the king's favored ally. He had dismissed them as the romantic ramblings of minstrels. Now, seeing her before him, he realized that the tales had not done her justice. "The king offers you a choice, my lady," he said, his voice losing some of its harshness. "Return willingly, and he promises leniency. Continue to resist," and he let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but understood. Isabel's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. Leniency? After a year of running, of living like a hunted animal? She knew the king's promises were as hollow as a dead tree. He wanted her submission, her complete and utter obedience. He wanted to break her, to make an example of her for any other noblewoman who dared to defy his will. "I will not be a pawn in his game," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to control it. "I would rather die." Gareth's gaze flickered to the dagger she still held clutched in her hand. It was a foolish gesture, a desperate act of defiance. He could disarm her in an instant. But he didn't. He saw something in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability beneath the steel, a hint of the woman she had once been, before the weight of the world had settled upon her shoulders. There are other ways to die, my lady, he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Some are slow, agonizing. Some are less so. He paused, his gaze holding hers. Shall we see if you are just as difficult to tame? The words were a challenge, a provocation, but they were also something more. They were an acknowledgement of her strength, of her refusal to surrender. And, strangely, they stirred a flicker of something within her, a spark of hope? No, not hope. That was too dangerous a word. But perhaps a chance. A chance to negotiate, to delay, to find a way out of this impossible situation. She lowered the dagger slightly, her hand still trembling. What do you propose, Sir Knight? He inclined his head, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. We have a long journey ahead of us, my lady. Time enough to discuss the possibilities. He gestured towards the darkening forest. Shall we find shelter for the night? The wind grows cold, and even a fugitive deserves a moment's rest. Isabel hesitated, her mind racing. Trusting him was madness. He was the king's man, sworn to obey his every command. But she was exhausted, her body aching, her spirit weary. And something in his eyes, that strange, unreadable expression, told her that perhaps, just perhaps, he was not entirely her enemy. With a reluctant nod, she sheathed her dagger and followed him into the deepening shadows, the scent of pine and damp earth filling her nostrils, the rustling of leaves whispering secrets in the gathering darkness. The hunt was over, but a new, far more dangerous game had just begun. A game where the stakes were not just her freedom, but her very heart. The falcon had captured the fugitive, but the question remained, who would truly be the hunter's prize? Chapter 2. A Night's Restraint. The shelter Gareth found was little more than a shallow cave, hidden beneath a rocky overhang. It offered scant protection from the elements, but it was better than nothing. He gathered some dry branches and, with a practiced hand, started a small fire. The flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls and illuminating his face, revealing the harsh lines etched by years of battle and hardship. Isabel watched him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to ward off the chill that seeped into her bones. She was acutely aware of his presence, of the sheer size and power of him. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator's awareness, even in this seemingly mundane task. She wondered what he was thinking, what plans he was making. Was he already anticipating the reward he would receive for delivering her to the king? He glanced up, catching her gaze. You should eat, my lady, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He offered her a strip of dried meat from his saddlebag. She hesitated, suspicion warring with hunger. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, relying on berries and roots she had foraged along the way. The aroma of the meat was tempting, but her pride rebelled against accepting anything from him. I am not hungry, she said, her voice stiff. Gareth raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his amber eyes. Pride will not fill your belly, my lady. And you will need your strength for the journey ahead. He tore off a piece of the meat and ate it himself, watching her over the flickering flames. Isabel's stomach growled, betraying her. She cursed her weakness, her body's rebellion against her will. Finally, with a sigh of resignation, she reached out and took the offered food. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, the smoky flavor filling her mouth. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional sigh of the wind. Isabel found herself studying him, trying to decipher the enigma that was Sir Gareth Fitzrohan. He was a handsome man, she had to admit, though his features were hardened by a life spent in the saddle and on the battlefield. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and a network of fine lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes. There was a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a pale, jagged line that spoke of a past encounter. He wore his armor with an ease that suggested it was a second skin, the metal gleaming faintly in the firelight. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were not the cold, calculating eyes of a hunter, but something far more complex. There was a weariness there, a hint of sadness, that resonated with her own hidden pain. Why did you run, my lady? he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Isabel stiffened, her guard instantly rising. That is none of your concern, Sir Knight. Perhaps not, he conceded. But I am curious. You are a noblewoman, of high birth. You could have had a comfortable life, a life of privilege. Why throw it all away? She looked away, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Comfort? Privilege? She repeated, her voice laced with bitterness. You speak of a gilded cage, Sir Knight. A life where I would have been nothing more than a broodmare, a pawn in my family's ambitions. I would rather live free, even in poverty, than be a prisoner in a silken gown. He was silent for a moment, considering her words. The Duke of Northwood is a powerful man, he said finally, and a cruel one, from what I hear. But the king is no better, she interrupted, her voice rising. He cares nothing for my happiness, for my well-being. He only cares about securing his alliances, about consolidating his power. I am nothing to him, just another piece on his chessboard. Gareth watched her, his expression thoughtful. He had heard rumors of the king's ruthlessness, of his disregard for the lives of those he considered his subjects. He had always served the king loyally, believing it was his duty, his honor. But now, seeing the raw pain in Isabel's eyes, hearing the desperation in her voice, he felt a flicker of doubt, a seed of unease. There are other ways to resist, my lady, he said quietly. You could have appealed to the church, sought sanctuary, and be confined to a convent for the rest of my days? She scoffed. Another form of imprisonment, Sir Knight. No, I chose to fight, to run. And I will continue to do so, until my last breath. He admired her spirit, her defiance, even as he knew it was futile. He had been ordered to bring her back, and he would do so. But something within him, a sense of fairness, a spark of compassion, made him want to find a way to soften the blow. Sleep, my lady, he said, his voice softening. You need to rest. He gestured towards a small pile of furs he had spread near the fire. Isabel hesitated, unsure whether to trust him. But exhaustion was a powerful persuader. She lay down on the furs, pulling her cloak tightly around her. She closed her eyes, but sleep eluded her. She was acutely aware of his presence, of the warmth of the fire, of the sounds of the night outside the cave. She heard him move, the soft clink of metal, and her eyes snapped open. He was standing over her, his silhouette outlined against the firelight. For a moment, she thought he was going to do something. But he simply reached down and gently draped his own cloak over her, adding another layer of warmth. Rest, my lady, he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. And then he moved back to his own side of the fire, settling down with his back against the cave wall, his sword within easy reach. Isabel lay there, staring up at the rough ceiling of the cave, her mind reeling. His gesture, so unexpected, so kind, had thrown her off balance. It was a small act of chivalry, a knight's restraint, but it spoke volumes. It was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the warrior. And it made her question everything she thought she knew about him and about the path that lay ahead. The night held its breath, as did she, with uncertainty looming larger than the cave itself. Chapter 3. The King's Decree. The journey back to the king's court was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Isabel rode behind Gareth, her hands bound loosely with a leather cord, a constant reminder of her captive status. She refused to speak to him, her silence a wall of defiance, a shield against the fear and uncertainty that gnawed at her. Gareth, for his part, maintained a respectful distance, his demeanor stoic and professional. He treated her with a courtesy that bordered on deference, ensuring she had food and water, and that she was as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. But he never let her forget that she was his prisoner. They traveled through forests and across rolling hills, the landscape a blur of greens and browns. The weather was unpredictable, shifting from bright sunshine to sudden downpours, mirroring the turmoil in Isabel's heart. She found herself studying the back of Gareth's head, the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself in the saddle. She hated him, she told herself. He was the instrument of her captivity, the man who was taking her back to a life she dreaded. But there were moments, fleeting and unexpected, when she saw a different side of him. A moment when he helped a lost child find its mother in a small village. A moment when he shared his meager rations with a starving beggar. A moment when he spoke softly to his horse, a magnificent warhorse named Valiant, stroking its neck with a tenderness that belied his warrior's exterior. These moments confused her, chipped away at her resolve. She wanted to hate him, to see him as a monster. But the more she saw of him, the more she realized that he was a complex man, a man of contradictions. He was a warrior, yes, but he was also capable of compassion. He was loyal to the king, but she sensed a growing unease within him, a questioning of the orders he had been given. One evening, as they camped beside a rushing stream, Gareth brought her a bowl of stew. She had been refusing to eat, her appetite suppressed by her despair. He sat down beside her, his gaze unwavering. "You must eat, my lady," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You will need your strength." "For what?" she retorted, her voice bitter. "To face the king's wrath? To be paraded before his court like a prize animal?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I do not know what the king intends," he said quietly. "But I will do what I can to protect you." His words surprised her. "Protect me?" she scoffed. "You are the one who captured me, who is taking me back to him." "I am following orders, my lady," he said. "But I am not without honor. I will not see you mistreated." Isabel looked at him, searching his eyes for any sign of deception. But she saw only sincerity, a weariness that mirrored her own. She realized, with a jolt, that he was as much a prisoner of his duty as she was of her circumstances. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do that?" He hesitated, then spoke, his voice low and rough. Because I believe you are innocent, my lady. I believe you deserve a chance to defend yourself." His words were a balm to her wounded spirit. For the first time since her capture, she felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness that surrounded her. She looked at him, her gaze softening. "Thank you, Sir Knight," she said, her voice trembling. He nodded, his expression unreadable. He stood up and walked away, leaving her to her thoughts. As she ate the stew, she found herself thinking about his words, about his promise to protect her. It was a foolish hope, perhaps, but it was all she had. The next day, as they neared the king's court, a messenger arrived, bearing the royal seal. Gareth read the scroll, his face growing grim. He turned to Isabel, his expression grave. "The king has decreed your fate, my lady," he said, his voice heavy. Isabel's heart sank. She had known this moment was coming, but she had still dared to hope for a miracle. She braced herself for the worst. "He has ordered that you be imprisoned in the Tower of London," Gareth continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Pending his decision." The Tower, a place of darkness and despair, where countless souls had met their end. Isabel felt a cold dread creep through her veins. She looked at Gareth, her eyes pleading. "Is there nothing you can do?" she asked, her voice trembling. He met her gaze, his amber eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and regret. "I will do what I can, my lady," he said. "But the king's word is law." He handed her the scroll. She took it with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the elegant script. The king's decree was clear, his intentions unmistakable. He wanted to break her, to make an example of her. And he had chosen the perfect place to do it. The Tower, a symbol of his power, of his absolute authority. And as she read on, she began to notice the subtle way the ink was shaped around certain phrases, specifically around the mention of the Duke of Northwood's name. A chill went up her spine. The decree held something more, something sinister. Chapter 4. Whispers of Westmere. The king's court was a whirlwind of activity, a cacophony of sounds and colors that assaulted Isabel's senses. After weeks of traveling through the quiet countryside, the sheer noise and bustle of the castle were overwhelming. She was led through the crowded halls, her hands still bound, the object of curious stares and whispered comments. She caught snippets of conversations, fragments of gossip that swirled around her like a storm. Lady Isabel of Westmere defied the king, the Duke of Northwood, a traitor the word stung, each one a reminder of her precarious situation. She was a traitor in the eyes of the court, a woman who had dared to defy the king's will. And the Duke of Northwood, the man she had refused to marry, was undoubtedly reveling in her downfall. Gareth remained by her side, a silent, watchful presence. He guided her through the maze of corridors, his hand occasionally resting lightly on her arm, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. She found herself drawing strength from his presence, from his quiet confidence. They were ushered into a small, sparsely furnished chamber, where a stern-faced woman waited. She was dressed in the somber garb of a lady-in-waiting, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Lady Isabel," she said, her voice cold and impersonal, "you are to be confined to these quarters until the king summons you." She gestured towards a narrow bed, a small table, and a single chair. "You will be provided with food and water, but you are to have no contact with anyone outside these walls, except by the king's express permission." Isabel nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. This was her prison, her cage. She was trapped at the mercy of the king. The woman left, locking the door behind her. Isabel sank onto the bed, her body trembling. She felt a sense of utter isolation, of being completely alone in a hostile world. Gareth remained standing, his gaze fixed on her. "I will speak to the king," he said, his voice low and determined. "I will try to persuade him to reconsider." Isabel looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Do you think it will do any good?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I do not know," he admitted. "But I must try. I gave you my word." He hesitated, then reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a fleeting gesture, but it sent a shiver through her. She had not been touched with such tenderness in a long time. "Rest, my lady," he said, his voice softening. "You need to regain your strength." He turned to leave, but she stopped him. "Gareth," she said, his name escaping her lips before she could stop it. He turned back, his eyebrows raised in surprise. It was the first time she had called him by his given name. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "For everything." He nodded, his expression unreadable. He opened the door and stepped out, locking it behind him. Isabel was left alone, in the silence of her prison. She lay down on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. She thought about Gareth, about his unexpected kindness, about his promise to help her. She clung to that hope, fragile as it was. As the hours passed, she began to hear whispers, faint sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first, she dismissed them as her imagination, the product of her fear and isolation. But they persisted, growing louder, more distinct. She realized with a jolt that they were voices coming from the other side of the wall. She pressed her ear against the cold stone, listening intently. "They say she's a witch consorted with the enemy, the Duke of Northwood," has proof the whispers were malicious, filled with venom. They were talking about her, spreading lies and accusations. She felt a surge of anger, of outrage. How dare they? She listened more closely, trying to identify the speakers. She recognized one of the voices, a high-pitched, nasal tone that belonged to Lady Beatrice, one of the Duke of Northwood's known confidants within court. Another she did not recognize, that she assumed to be in the Duke's pocket. "The king is furious, he will make an example of her." The burning, the last word sent a chill down Isabel's spine. The burning. The fate of witches, of traitors. Was that what the king intended for her? She was trapped, with no means of contact to anyone who could tell the truth. The whispers became a constant drone in the walls, and her blood froze. Chapter 5. Scars of the Past. Gareth paced restlessly outside the king's chambers, waiting for an audience. He had been cooling his heels for hours, the king's advisors making excuses, delaying the inevitable. He knew they were wary of him, of his unexpected sympathy for Lady Isabel. They saw him as a potential obstacle to their plans, to the king's wishes. He clenched his fists, his frustration growing. He had to see the king to plead Isabel's case. He had to make him understand that she was not a traitor, that she was a victim of circumstance, of the Duke of Northwood's machinations. He thought back to his own past, to the scars he carried, both visible and hidden. He had lost his wife, Alara, to a fever 5 years ago, a loss that had left him hollow and empty. He had thrown himself into his duty, into the service of the king, seeking solace in action, in the discipline of a soldier's life. But Alara's death had not been the only blow. He had also lost his younger brother, Thomas, in a battle against a rebellious lord. Thomas had been reckless, impetuous, and Gareth had always felt responsible for him. He had failed to protect him, and the guilt had haunted him ever since. He had sworn an oath to the king, a vow of loyalty and obedience. But he had also sworn an oath to himself, to uphold justice, to protect the innocent. And he believed Isabel was innocent. He saw a parallel between her situation and his own. She was trapped by circumstances, by the machinations of powerful enemies. He had been trapped by his grief, by his guilt. He felt a kinship with her, a shared sense of loss and injustice. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the doors to the king's chambers opened. A young page beckoned him inside. King Alaric was seated on his throne, a massive, imposing figure, his face etched with lines of power and authority. He was surrounded by his advisors, their faces a mixture of obsequiousness and suspicion. Gareth approached the throne, bowing low. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "I beg an audience to speak on behalf of Lady Isabel of Westmere." The king fixed him with a cold stare. "Sir Gareth," he said, his voice a deep rumble, "you have performed your duty admirably. You have brought the fugitive to justice. What more is there to discuss?" Gareth took a deep breath. "Your Majesty, I believe Lady Isabel is innocent of the charges against her. She is a victim of the Duke of Northwood's ambition, of his desire to acquire her lands and title." The king's advisors stirred, murmuring amongst themselves. The Duke of Northwood, who was present, stepped forward, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice dripping with venom, "this is outrageous. Lady Isabel is a traitor, a rebel who defied your royal command. She deserves to be punished to the full extent of the law." Gareth turned to face the Duke, his eyes blazing. "You lie, my lord," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have fabricated evidence. You have spread false rumors. You seek to destroy an innocent woman for your own gain." The Duke scoffed. "You have no proof, Sir Knight. You are blinded by the lady's beauty, by her wiles." Gareth took a step closer to the Duke, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "I have seen the fear in her eyes, my lord," he said. "I have seen the courage in her heart. She is no traitor. She is a woman fighting for her freedom, for her very life." The king raised a hand, silencing them both. "Enough," he said, his voice weary. "I will hear no more of this. Lady Isabel will be judged according to the law. The evidence will be presented, and she will have an opportunity to defend herself." Gareth bowed his head. "Your Majesty, I beg you to consider her plight. She is alone, friendless, surrounded by enemies. She needs someone to speak for her, to defend her against these false accusations." The king studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And you believe you are that person, Sir Knight?" Gareth met the king's gaze, his own unwavering. "I believe I am, Your Majesty. I have seen her, I have spoken with her. I believe she is innocent, and I will do everything in my power to prove it." The king sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Very well, Sir Gareth," he said. "You may speak on her behalf. But I warn you, if you fail to convince me, if the evidence proves her guilt, she will face the consequences. And so will you." Gareth bowed again, his heart pounding. "I understand, Your Majesty. I will not fail you. Or her." He left the king's chambers, his mind racing. He had won a reprieve, a chance to defend Isabel. But he knew the odds were stacked against him. The Duke of Northwood was a powerful enemy, and the king was unpredictable. He had little time and so many secrets yet to unearth. He would need proof, solid and irrefutable, or all was lost. He felt the weight of Alara's locket, hidden within the breast of his tunic. He had made a promise. Chapter 6. Beneath a Caged Moon. Isabel spent her days in a state of anxious anticipation, her nights haunted by the whispers from the walls. She had no way of knowing what was happening outside her chamber, what machinations were being plotted against her. She felt like a fly caught in a spider's web, waiting for the inevitable. She paced the small room, her restless energy finding no outlet. She examined every inch of the walls, searching for a hidden passage, a secret escape. But there was nothing. The stones were solid, unyielding. She tried to pray, to find solace in her faith. But her prayers felt hollow, empty. She had always been a devout woman, but now, facing the possibility of a cruel and unjust death, her faith wavered. She thought about her family, about her father, the late Earl of Westmere, a kind and just man who had taught her to value honor and integrity. She thought about her mother, a gentle soul who had died when Isabel was still a child. She had no siblings, no close relatives to turn to. She was alone, utterly alone. She thought about Gareth, about his unexpected kindness, about his promise to defend her. She clung to that hope, fragile as it was. He was the only person who seemed to believe in her innocence, the only one who was willing to stand up for her. She found herself replaying their encounters in her mind, searching for clues, for hidden meanings. His gaze, his touch, his words, they all seemed to carry a weight, a significance that she couldn't quite decipher. One night, as she lay on her bed, staring up at the small, barred window, she saw the moon, a pale, silvery disk in the inky sky. It was a caged moon, she thought, just like her. Trapped, unable to escape its fate. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint scratching sound coming from the wall. She sat up, her heart pounding. The whispers again? But this was different. It wasn't voices, it was something else. She pressed her ear against the wall, listening intently. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. And then, a small section of the wall, near the floor, crumbled inward, revealing a dark opening. Isabel stared at the hole, her mind reeling.
Un secret passage?
Was it possible? She hesitated, fear warring with hope. It could be a trap, a trick to lure her into further danger. But it could also be a way out, a chance to escape. She reached out and touched the loose stones, her fingers trembling. They gave way easily, revealing more of the opening. It was large enough for her to crawl through. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from the door to the window to the hole in the wall. She had to make a decision, and she had to make it quickly. Taking a deep breath, she got down on her hands and knees and crawled into the opening. The passage was narrow and dark, the air thick with dust, and the smell of damp earth. She crawled blindly, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She had no idea where the passage led, or what dangers awaited her. But she knew she couldn't stay in that chamber, waiting for the king's judgment. She had to take a chance, to fight for her freedom. The passage twisted and turned, sloping downwards. She crawled for what seemed like an eternity, her hands and knees scraped and bleeding. She could hear the sounds of the castle above her, muffled and distant. Finally, she saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. She crawled towards it, her hope surging. The passage opened into a small, dark chamber, lit only by a single torch on the wall. She stood up, brushing the dust from her clothes. She looked around the chamber, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. It was empty, except for a wooden chest in one corner and a narrow doorway on the opposite wall. She approached the doorway, her hand reaching for the latch. She hesitated, her heart pounding. What awaited her on the other side? Was it freedom or another trap? The flickering light from the walls seemed to pulse, almost in rhythm with her heart. She took another breath, knowing that she had risked this far. Turning back was not an option. Chapter 7. The Price of Defiance. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading down into darkness. Isabel hesitated, her senses on high alert. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of mildew, and something else, something metallic, like old blood. She took a tentative step onto the staircase, her hand gripping the rough stone wall. The torchlight barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to watch her every move. She descended slowly, carefully, each step echoing in the silence. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding down into the bowels of the castle. She wondered where it led, what secrets it held. Was it a forgotten escape route, or a path to something far more sinister? As she descended, she began to hear sounds, faint and indistinct at first, but growing louder as she went deeper. The sounds of moans, of whispers, of clanking chains. She realized, with a growing sense of dread, that she was descending into the castle dungeons. A place of torment, of suffering, where prisoners were left to rot and die. She almost turned back, her fear overwhelming her. But something propelled her forward, a stubborn refusal to surrender, a desperate hope that she might find a way out. She reached the bottom of the staircase and found herself in a long, dark corridor, lined with cells. The air was heavy with the stench of decay and despair. She could hear the sounds of suffering coming from the cells, the cries of the prisoners, their pleas for mercy. She walked along the corridor, her eyes scanning the cells, her heart aching for the suffering she witnessed. Most of the cells were empty, their former occupants long dead. But some held living prisoners, emaciated figures huddled in the darkness, their eyes hollow and lifeless. She saw a young man, chained to the wall, his body covered in sores. He looked at her with pleading eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer. She saw an old woman, curled up on the floor, her face a mask of despair. She saw a child, no older than 10, his body trembling with fear. Isabel felt a surge of anger, of outrage. How could the king allow such suffering? How could he be so cruel, so heartless? She continued along the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She reached the end and found another door, this one made of heavy iron, reinforced with steel bars. She tried the handle, but it was locked. She looked around, searching for a key, a way to open the door. But there was nothing. She leaned her forehead against the cold iron, her despair growing. She was trapped, in the heart of the darkness, surrounded by suffering and death. Suddenly, she heard a voice, a low, raspy whisper. Who is there? She turned, her eyes scanning the corridor. She saw a figure huddled in one of the cells, hidden in the shadows. It is I, Isabel of Westmere, she said, her voice trembling. Who are you? The figure stirred, slowly emerging from the shadows. It was an old man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and hollow. He was dressed in rags, his body emaciated and frail. But there was a spark of intelligence in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition. Lady Isabel? He whispered, his voice incredulous. What are you doing here? I escaped from my chamber, she said. I found a secret passage. The old man shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and pity. You poor child, he whispered. You have stumbled into the lion's den. Who are you? Isabel asked again, her voice urgent. I was Lord Elmsworth, he said, his voice fading. A former advisor to the king. Isabel's eyes widened. Lord Elmsworth? She had heard of him, a wise and respected nobleman who had mysteriously disappeared from court several years ago. Rumor had it that he had fallen out of favor with the king, that he had been accused of treason. What happened to you? She asked, her voice filled with concern. I learned too much, he whispered. I discovered the king's secrets, the Duke of Northwood's treachery, he coughed, a racking sound that shook his frail body. The king, he had me imprisoned, tortured. Isabel felt a surge of horror. The Duke of Northwood? She repeated, her voice incredulous. What treachery? He seeks to overthrow the king, Elmsworth whispered, his voice growing weaker. He plans to seize the throne. He paused, struggling to breathe. He has been manipulating the king, poisoning his mind, turning him against his loyal subjects and the king's decree. Isabel stated, her voice a whisper. The wording, it pointed to the Duke, not as my betrothed, but as a participant in my alleged crimes. Elmsworth nodded weakly. The Duke that framed you, so that you wouldn't reveal what he planned at your wedding. Isabel felt a cold rage wash over her. The Duke of Northwood was not only a cruel and ambitious man, he was a traitor, a threat to the entire kingdom. And she was a pawn in his game, a victim of his treachery. She looked at Elmsworth, her eyes suddenly clear. She knew what she had to do. It was no longer merely about surviving. This was about justice. But the old lord's eyes had closed. Chapter 8. A bargain struck. Isabel knelt beside Lord Elmsworth, checking for a pulse. It was faint, thready but present. He was alive but barely. She knew she had to get him out of there, to find help. But how? She was trapped in the dungeons, with no key to the iron door. She looked around the cell, searching for anything that might be of use. A broken stool, a rusty bucket, a few scraps of cloth, nothing. She felt a surge of despair, of helplessness. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint scraping sound coming from the corridor. She froze, listening intently. It was the sound of footsteps, approaching slowly. She pressed herself against the wall, hiding in the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was it? A guard? Another prisoner? Or something worse? The footsteps stopped outside the cell. Isabel held her breath, her eyes fixed on the doorway. A figure appeared, silhouetted against the dim light. It was Gareth. Relief washed over her, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. But it was quickly followed by confusion. What was he doing here in the dungeons? He saw her, his eyes widening in surprise. Isabel? He whispered, his voice incredulous. How did you get here? She quickly explained about the secret passage, about Lord Elmsworth, about the Duke of Northwood's treachery. Gareth listened, his expression growing grim. I knew it, he muttered, his voice filled with anger. I knew something was wrong. The Duke, he has been too eager to see you condemned. We have to get Lord Elmsworth out of here, Isabel said, her voice urgent. He knows the truth. He can expose the Duke's plot. Gareth nodded. But how? The door is locked, and I have no key. He examined the lock, his brow furrowed in concentration. He pulled out a small dagger, the one he had used to start the fire on their first night together. It was a simple blade, but strong. I might be able to pick the lock, he said, his voice doubtful. But it will take time, and it's risky. If a guard comes, we have no choice, Isabel said, her voice firm. We have to try. Gareth nodded, setting to work on the lock. He inserted the dagger, his fingers moving with a practiced skill. Isabel watched him, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The sounds of the dungeons seemed to amplify, the moans of the prisoners, the dripping of water, the clanking of chains. Isabel kept watch, her eyes darting to the corridor, listening for any sign of approaching guards. Finally, after what seemed like an age, there was a click. The lock turned. Gareth pushed open the door, his face etched with relief. Come, he said, his voice urgent. We must hurry. He helped Isabel lift Lord Elmsworth, his body surprisingly light, almost weightless. They carried him between them, moving as quickly as they could along the corridor. They reached the staircase and began to ascend, Gareth leading the way, Isabel supporting Elmsworth's frail body. It was a slow, arduous climb, their progress hampered by the old man's weakness. They reached the top of the staircase and emerged into the small chamber where Isabel had first entered the passage. Gareth closed the door, concealing the entrance. We need to find a safe place, he said, his voice low. Somewhere we can hide, tend to Elmsworth, and plan our next move. Isabel nodded. But where? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. The castle is crawling with the Duke's men. Gareth thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. There is a place, he said finally. An old hunting lodge, in the forest outside the castle walls. It's abandoned, forgotten. We might be safe there. But how do we get out of the castle? Isabel asked. The gates are guarded. Gareth smiled, a grim, determined smile. There are other ways, he said. Secret passages, known only to a few. I used to explore them as a boy. He led her to another wall, pressing a hidden stone. A section of the wall slid open, revealing another dark passage. This will take us to the stables, he said. From there, we can ride out into the forest. Isabel nodded, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of hope. They enter the passage, Gareth leading the way, Isabel carrying the precious burden, the one that contained proof. A bargain had been struck between a knight and his prisoner, a shared risk for a greater good. They had exchanged trust in a hidden pact, forged beneath a caged moon. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Great Hall. The ride to the hunting lodge was a blur of darkness and fear. Isabel clung to Gareth's back, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her face buried in his cloak. The wind whipped at her hair, the cold air stinging her cheeks. She could hear the pounding of Valiant's hooves, the creaking of the saddle, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Gareth rode with a fierce determination, his body tense, his senses on high alert. He knew they were being hunted, that the Duke of Northwood would stop at nothing to silence them. He had to get Isabel and Lord Elmsworth to safety, to protect them from the Duke's wrath. They reached the hunting lodge just as dawn was breaking, the sky a pale, silvery gray. The lodge was a small, dilapidated structure, hidden deep within the forest. It was overgrown with ivy, the windows boarded up, the roof sagging. But it was shelter, a place to hide. Gareth dismounted, helping Isabel down. He carried Lord Elmsworth inside, laying him gently on a pile of old furs. The old man was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Isabel knelt beside him, her heart filled with concern. She checked his pulse, her fingers trembling. It was weak, fluttering. "He needs a physician," she said, her voice desperate. "He needs medicine." Gareth shook his head. "We cannot risk going back to the castle," he said. "The Duke's men are everywhere. We would be captured immediately." "But he will die if we do nothing," Isabel pleaded. Gareth looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and regret. "I know," he said, "but we have to be patient. We have to wait for the right moment." He began to make the lodge as comfortable as possible, clearing away debris, building a fire in the hearth. The flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the room, chasing away some of the chill. Isabel tended to Lord Elmsworth, bathing his forehead with cool water, trying to ease his fever. She spoke to him softly, soothingly, telling him that he was safe, that they would protect him. As the day wore on, Gareth kept watch, his eyes scanning the forest, his hand never far from his sword. He knew the Duke would be searching for them, that he would not rest until he had found them. Isabel remained by Lord Elmsworth's side, her anxiety growing. The old man's condition was worsening, his breathing becoming more labored, his fever rising. She thought about the Duke of Northwood, about his treachery, about his plot to overthrow the king. She felt a surge of anger, of determination. She would not let him win. She would expose his crimes. She would clear her name. She would save the kingdom. She remembered the whispers she had heard in her chamber, the rumors and accusations that had been spread about her. She realized that the Duke had been planning this for a long time, that he had carefully crafted a web of lies to ensnare her. She thought about the king, about his trust in the Duke, his blindness to his treachery. She wondered if he would ever believe the truth, if he would ever see the Duke for what he truly was. As evening approached, Gareth returned to the lodge, his face grim. "I have scouted the area," he said. "The Duke's men are searching the forest, but they have not yet found our trail." "How long can we stay here?" Isabel asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Not long," Gareth said. "We need to find a way to reach the king, to present our evidence before it's too late." "But how?" Isabel asked. "The castle is surrounded. We are outnumbered, outmatched." Gareth paced the room, his mind racing. He thought about his options, his resources. He had his sword, his skill, his knowledge of the castle and its surroundings. But it wasn't enough. Suddenly, he stopped pacing, his eyes lighting up. "I have an idea," he said. "It's risky, dangerous, but it might work." He explained his plan, his voice low and urgent. It involved a secret passage, a hidden chamber, a daring gamble. Isabel listened, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. It was a desperate plan, a long shot. But it was their only hope. They had to try. And in the silence of the old hunting lodge, their preparations began. Echoes of a daring plan swirling, ready to clash with the echoes in the great hall of the king's court. The stakes were higher than ever before. Chapter 10. The Serpent's Kiss. Gareth's plan hinged on reaching a hidden chamber located directly beneath the great hall. It was a place known only to a handful of the oldest castle servants and, supposedly, the royal family themselves. It was said to have been used in times of siege, a last refuge, a secret escape route. He remembered his father, a former captain of the guard, showing it to him when he was a boy, making him swear never to reveal its existence. The entrance was concealed behind a tapestry in a rarely used antechamber off the Great Hall. Gareth hoped that the Duke of Northwood, in his arrogance, would be focused on the more obvious entrances and defenses of the castle, overlooking this forgotten passage. They left Lord Elmsworth in the relative safety of the hunting lodge, with Isabel promising to return as soon as possible. The journey back to the castle was fraught with peril. They moved under cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the shadows. They reached the castle walls undetected, scaling a section that Gareth knew to be less heavily guarded. They slipped inside, moving like wraiths through the deserted corridors. The castle was eerily quiet, the usual bustle and activity replaced by an unsettling stillness. They reached the antechamber, their hearts pounding in their chests. Gareth carefully pulled back the tapestry, revealing a blank stone wall. He pressed a hidden stone, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow, dark passage. They entered the passage, Gareth leading the way, Isabel close behind. The air was thick with dust and the smell of damp earth. They descended a steep, winding staircase, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They reached the bottom and found themselves in a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with ancient scrolls and dusty tomes. In the center of the room was a large stone table, covered in a thick layer of dust. Gareth examined the walls, searching for the next passage. He found it, concealed behind a bookshelf. He pushed the bookshelf aside, revealing another narrow opening. "This leads directly beneath the Great Hall," he said, his voice low. "We will be able to hear everything that is said. And if the opportunity arises, we can make our presence known." Isabel nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. They entered the passage, crawling on their hands and knees. The air was close and stifling, the darkness almost complete. They reached the end of the passage and found themselves behind a thin stone grille, looking out into the great hall. The hall was brightly lit, filled with courtiers and nobles. The king was seated on his throne, his face grim and resolute. The Duke of Northwood stood beside him, his expression smug and confident. Isabel recognized many of the faces in the crowd, members of the court who had once been her friends, her allies. Now, they looked at her with suspicion, with contempt. The Duke was speaking, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Your Majesty," he said, "the evidence is clear. Lady Isabel is a traitor, a conspirator who plotted against your throne. She deserves the harshest punishment." Isabel felt a surge of anger, of outrage. How dare he? How could he stand there and lie so brazenly? She saw the king hesitate, his eyes filled with doubt. He looked at the Duke, then at the crowd, then at the empty space where Isabel should have been standing. I do not know what to believe," he said, his voice weary. "I have always trusted you, Lord Northwood." But the Duke stepped closer to the king, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your Majesty," he said, "you must be strong. You must show no weakness. The kingdom is watching. Your enemies are waiting for any sign of indecision." He placed his hand on the king's arm, his fingers tightening in a subtle, yet menacing gesture. It was a serpent's kiss, a gesture of feigned loyalty that masked a deadly threat. Isabel gasped, realizing the full extent of the Duke's treachery. He was not just plotting against her, he was plotting against the king himself. He was poisoning his mind, controlling him, manipulating him. Gareth saw it too, his eyes narrowing in anger. He knew they had to act, and act quickly. The king was in danger. The kingdom was at stake. He looked at Isabel, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Now," he whispered, "we reveal ourselves."
Now.
He gripped the stone grill, preparing to push his way into the great hall, to reveal the treachery and, hopefully, save them all. It was the moment of truth. Chapter 11. Flight at Dawn. Gareth pushed against the stone grill, but it wouldn't budge. It was heavier than he anticipated, reinforced with iron bars hidden within the stonework. He tried again, putting all his weight behind it, but it remained stubbornly fixed. "It's no use," he whispered, his voice strained. "It's too strong." Isabel's heart sank. They were so close, yet so far. They could hear the Duke of Northwood's lies, see the king's growing unease, but they were powerless to intervene. "There must be another way," she whispered, her voice desperate. "A lever, a switch, something." They examined the small space behind the grill, searching for any sign of a mechanism. But there was nothing. The walls were smooth, unyielding. Suddenly, Isabel remembered something. "The scrolls," she said, her voice urgent. "The chamber we passed through, it was filled with old scrolls. Perhaps there's something there, a clue, a diagram." Gareth nodded.
"It's worth a try," he said.
"But we must be quick." They crawled back through the passage, returning to the circular chamber. They began to frantically search the shelves, pulling out scrolls, unrolling them, scanning them for any sign of a hidden mechanism. The scrolls were ancient, brittle, written in a language that was difficult to decipher. Most of them were filled with historical accounts, philosophical treatises, religious texts, nothing that seemed relevant. As time ticked by, their hope began to dwindle. They could hear the voices in the great hall, the Duke's relentless accusations, the king's growing indecision. Finally, just as they were about to give up, Isabel found a scroll that seemed different. It was smaller than the others, made of a different material, a kind of treated leather. She unrolled it carefully, her hands trembling. It was a diagram, a detailed plan of the castle, showing the secret passages, the hidden chambers. And there, marked with a small symbol, was the mechanism that controlled the grill in the great hall. "Gareth, look!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement. Gareth examined the diagram, his eyes widening. "It's a pressure plate," he said. "Hidden beneath the floor in this chamber. We need to find it." They searched the floor, pressing every stone, feeling for any sign of a hidden mechanism. Finally, Gareth found it, a slightly raised stone near the center of the room. He pressed down on the stone, and they heard a click, a grinding sound. They rushed back to the passage leading to the great hall, and this time, when Gareth pushed against the grill, it swung open easily. They emerged into the great hall, blinking in the sudden brightness. The scene before them was frozen, a tableau of shock and disbelief. The king, the Duke of Northwood, the courtiers all stared at them, their mouths agape, their eyes wide with surprise. Gareth stepped forward, his sword drawn, his voice ringing out across the hall. "Your Majesty," he said, "I bring you proof of the Duke of Northwood's treachery." The Duke recovered quickly, his face turning pale with anger. "Seize them," he shouted to the guards. "They are traitors, conspirators." But the guards hesitated, their eyes shifting from the Duke to Gareth, to Isabel. They had heard the rumors, the whispers. They were unsure who to believe. Isabel stepped forward, her head held high, her voice clear and strong. "The Duke is lying,"
she cried.
"He is the traitor, not I. He has been plotting against the king, seeking to seize the throne for himself." She pointed to the Duke, her finger trembling with righteous anger. "He imprisoned Lord Elmsworth, a loyal advisor to the king, because he knew the truth. He fabricated evidence against me, to silence me, to prevent me from exposing his crimes." The king looked at the Duke, his eyes filled with suspicion. "Is this true, Northwood?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. The Duke tried to bluff his way out, but his voice faltered, his confidence shaken. "Your Majesty, this is absurd. They are lying, I swear it." Gareth produced the scroll, the diagram of the castle.
"This is proof, Your Majesty," he said.
A plan of the castle, showing the secret passages, the hidden chambers. "And this," he added, pulling out a small vial filled with a dark liquid, "this is the poison the Duke has been using to weaken you, to control you." He had found the vial in the secret chamber, hidden amongst the scrolls. It was labeled with the Duke's crest. The king stared at the vial, his face turning ashen. He recognized the crest, the poison. He had been feeling weak, ill for months. He had attributed it to his age, to his grief. But now he looked at the Duke, his eyes filled with a cold fury. You betrayed me," he whispered, his voice trembling. The Duke knew he was finished. He made a desperate move, drawing his own sword, lunging at the king. But Gareth was faster. He intercepted the Duke's blow, his sword clashing against his. A fierce duel ensued, the clang of steel echoing through the great hall. Gareth was the superior swordsman, his movements swift and precise. The Duke, fueled by desperation, fought with a savage intensity. But in the end, it was Gareth who prevailed. He disarmed the Duke, his sword pointing at his throat. "Yield, Northwood," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Your treachery is over." The Duke, defeated and disgraced, dropped to his knees. The guards, finally realizing the truth, seized him, binding his hands. The king, still reeling from the shock of the betrayal, looked at Gareth, at Isabel. You saved my life," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved the kingdom." Isabel met the king's gaze, her own unwavering.
"We only sought justice, Your Majesty," she said.
"For ourselves, for Lord Elmsworth, for the kingdom." As the sun rose, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, Gareth and Isabel fled the castle, leaving behind the chaos and the shattered remnants of the Duke's plot. The king, weak but alive, had ordered their escape, knowing their lives were still in danger from the Duke's loyalists. They rode towards the distant horizon. It was a flight at dawn, a desperate race for freedom, a new chapter beginning under a sky washed clean of treachery. Chapter 12. The Hunter's Snare. Their escape was not as clean as they had hoped. Though the king had ordered a small contingent of loyal guards to assist them, the Duke of Northwood's influence ran deep within the castle walls. Word of their flight spread quickly, and soon, they were being pursued, not just by a handful of disgruntled loyalists, but by a well-organized force, determined to silence them permanently. Gareth, with his intimate knowledge of the surrounding countryside, led them through a treacherous network of hidden paths and forgotten trails. Isabel, despite her exhaustion and the lingering fear, rode with a newfound determination. She had faced death, betrayal, and imprisonment, and she would not be broken. They rode for days, stopping only for brief periods of rest, always on the move, always looking over their shoulders. The landscape blurred around them, a tapestry of forests, hills, and rivers. They were hunted, their pursuers relentless, their resources dwindling. Gareth was a constant source of strength, his calm demeanor and unwavering resolve a comfort to Isabel. He was skilled in the ways of the wilderness, able to find food and water, to build makeshift shelters, to navigate by the stars. He was a warrior, a protector, but he was also something more. He was a friend, a confidant, a kindred spirit. Isabel found herself drawn to him, her initial animosity replaced by a growing respect, a burgeoning affection. She saw the kindness in his eyes, the gentleness in his touch, the sadness that lingered beneath his stoic exterior. She saw the man beneath the armor, the heart beneath the warrior. One evening, as they camped beside a small stream, Gareth spoke of his past, of his lost wife, Ilara. He spoke of his grief, his guilt, his struggle to find meaning in a world that had taken so much from him. Isabel listened, her heart aching for him. She shared her own pain, her own losses, her own fears. They found solace in each other's company, a shared understanding that transcended their circumstances. "I never thought I would feel again," Gareth said, his voice low and rough. "After Ilara, I closed myself off. I became a shell, a weapon. But you have awakened something within me. Something I thought was dead." Isabel met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "And she whispered, "I never thought I would trust again. After everything. But you have shown me that there is still goodness in the world. That there is still hope." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a tender gesture, a silent acknowledgement of their growing bond. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Their pursuers had found them. Gareth sprang to his feet, his sword drawn. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent.
"Now."
They mounted their horses and rode, plunging into the darkness, the sounds of their pursuers echoing behind them. It was a desperate chase, a race against time. Gareth led them through a dense forest, the trees looming around them like giant sentinels. The branches whipped at their faces, the undergrowth snagged at their clothes. They rode blindly, trusting in Gareth's instincts, in his knowledge of the terrain. But their pursuers were gaining on them. They could hear their shouts, their curses, the pounding of their horses' hooves. Gareth knew they couldn't outrun them. They needed to find a place to make a stand, to fight back. He led them to a narrow ravine, a natural choke point. "This is where we stop," he said, his voice grim. "This is where we fight." He dismounted, helping Isabel down. He positioned her behind a large rock, giving her a small dagger. "Stay hidden," he said. "And, if anything happens to me, run. Don't look back." Isabel nodded, her heart pounding with fear. She watched as Gareth prepared for battle, his movements swift and precise. He was a warrior, born and bred, and he would face his enemies with courage and determination. But the odds were stacked against him. The pursuers arrived, their faces contorted with rage, their swords gleaming in the moonlight. They were led by a tall, brutal-looking man, a captain in the Duke of Northwood's guard. "Surrender, Fitzrohan," the captain shouted. "You cannot escape." Gareth stood his ground, his sword held high. "I will not surrender," he said, his voice ringing out across the ravine. "I will fight for my freedom, for the freedom of Lady Isabel." The battle began. It was a fierce, brutal clash, the clang of steel echoing through the night. Gareth fought with the skill and ferocity of a cornered lion, but he was outnumbered, surrounded. The hunter had become the hunted, and the snare was closing in. It seemed inevitable. Chapter 13. Between Two Kingdoms. Isabel watched from her hiding place, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to help Gareth, to fight beside him, but she knew she would be more of a hindrance than a help. He had told her to stay hidden, and she would obey for now. The battle raged, a chaotic swirl of movement and sound. Gareth fought with incredible skill, his sword a blur of silver, deflecting blows, parrying thrusts, cutting down his attackers. But he was tiring, his movements becoming slower, his breathing more labored. The captain of the guard, a hulking brute of a man, pressed his attack, his sword whistling through the air. Gareth parried, but the blow was too strong, knocking his sword from his hand. He stumbled back, unarmed, facing his enemies. The captain raised his sword, ready to deliver the final blow. Isabel screamed, unable to remain silent any longer. She scrambled out from behind the rock, the small dagger clutched in her hand, ready to throw herself between Gareth and his attacker. But before she could reach him, another figure emerged from the trees, a figure clad in shining armor, riding a magnificent warhorse. It was a knight, his face hidden behind a visored helmet, the crest of a golden falcon emblazoned on his surcoat. The knight charged into the fray, his sword flashing, scattering the Duke's men like leaves in the wind. He rode with a skill and ferocity that surpassed even Gareth's, his movements fluid and graceful, his attacks precise and deadly. The captain of the guard turned to face the new threat, his eyes widening in surprise. He raised his sword to defend himself, but the knight was too quick. With a single, swift blow, he unhorsed the captain, sending him sprawling to the ground. The remaining guards, seeing their leader fall, hesitated, their courage faltering. The knight pressed his advantage, driving them back, forcing them to retreat. Within minutes, the battle was over. The Duke's men were routed, fleeing in disarray. The knight turned his attention to Gareth, who was still standing, unarmed and stunned. The knight dismounted, approaching Gareth slowly. He removed his helmet, revealing his face. It was a face Isabel knew, a face she had seen in portraits, in tapestries. It was King Alaric. Gareth stared at the king, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Your Majesty?" he whispered, his voice incredulous. "But how?" The king smiled, a weary but genuine smile. "I received word of your flight," he said, "and of the Duke of Northwood's treachery. I realized I had been deceived, manipulated. I had to find you, to set things right." He looked at Isabel, his gaze softening. "Lady Isabel," he said, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you. I allowed myself to be blinded by the Duke's lies. I am truly sorry." Isabel met the king's gaze, her own unwavering. "Your Majesty," she said, "I accept your apology. But there is still much to be done. The Duke's influence runs deep. There are others who are loyal to him, who will seek to continue his plot." The king nodded. "I know," he said, "and I will deal with them. But first, we must return to the castle. We must secure the kingdom, restore order." The king's arrival was as much of a shock as finding an oasis in the desert. He turned to Gareth, his expression serious. "Sir Gareth," he said, "you have shown great courage and loyalty. You have saved my life. You have protected Lady Isabel. I am in your debt." He paused, then continued. "I have a task for you, a mission of great importance. I want you to go to the neighboring kingdom of Northumbria. Seek the aid of King Edward. Tell him what has happened, show him the evidence. We will need his help to secure our borders, to prevent the Duke's allies from launching an attack." Northumbria was a powerful kingdom, ruled by a just and wise king. Their alliance would be crucial in the coming days. Gareth bowed his head. "I will do as you command, Your Majesty," he said. The king turned back to Isabel. "Lady Isabel, you will ride on your journey together." He handed her Elmsworth's papers. "And, when you have finished helping Sir Gareth in the north, return to me. Your lands are no longer forfeit, and I need your counsel." Isabel and Gareth exchanged a look, a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They were safe for now. But their journey was far from over. They were caught between two kingdoms, their fate hanging in the balance. They rode together, once as prisoner and hunter, and now as trusted envoys. Chapter 14. A Warrior's Tenderness. The journey to Northumbria was arduous, but it offered a respite from the constant threat of pursuit. Gareth and Isabel rode side by side, their earlier animosity completely dispelled, replaced by a growing sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. They were no longer prisoner and captor, but allies, bound by a shared purpose and a growing affection. They spoke little of the events at the castle, of the king's apology, of their mission. The weight of their responsibilities hung heavy between them, a silent reminder of the dangers that still lay ahead. Instead, they spoke of other things, of their lives before the turmoil, of their hopes and dreams, of their fears and regrets. They shared stories, memories, moments of laughter and sadness. They learned about each other, discovering hidden depths, unexpected similarities. Gareth was surprised by Isabel's resilience, her strength of character, her unwavering determination. He had expected to find a spoiled, pampered noblewoman, but instead, he found a woman of courage, intelligence, and compassion. Isabel, in turn, was surprised by Gareth's gentleness, his kindness, his vulnerability. She had expected to find a cold, ruthless warrior, but instead, she found a man of honor, integrity, and a deep-seated sadness that resonated with her own. One evening, as they camped beneath a canopy of stars, Gareth spoke of his late wife, Elara, again. This time, however, there was a new note in his voice, a hint of acceptance, of peace. "I loved her deeply," he said, his voice soft and wistful. "She was my light, my joy, my everything. Losing her, it broke me. I thought I would never feel again, never love again." He looked at Isabel, his amber eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "But you have shown me that it is possible to heal, to move on, to find happiness again. You have given me hope. Isabel met his gaze, her heart aching for him, for his loss, for his pain. She reached out and gently touched his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. And you, Gareth, she whispered, you have shown me that it is possible to trust again, to believe in the goodness of others. You have given me strength, courage, a reason to fight. He squeezed her hand, his grip tightening. He leaned closer, his gaze searching hers. He saw the warmth in her eyes, the tenderness in her smile, the vulnerability that mirrored his own. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a gentle exploration, a hesitant offering. Isabel responded, her lips parting slightly, her body leaning into his. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense. It was a release of pent-up emotions, of fear and longing, of hope and desire. It was a connection, a bond, a promise. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, alone beneath the stars. Gareth reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. Isabel, he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. I think I'm falling in love with you. Isabel's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming emotion. And Gareth, she whispered back, I think I'm falling in love with you too. They kissed again, a long, slow, tender kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their love. It was a warrior's tenderness, a gentle touch that belied the strength of his hands, the power of his body. It was a moment of peace, of happiness, of hope, in a world filled with chaos and uncertainty. They spent the night in each other's arms, wrapped in a cocoon of warmth and affection. They spoke of their future, of their dreams, of a life together, free from the constraints of duty and obligation. It was a fragile dream, a precarious hope, but it was theirs. The shared vulnerability of the moment was precious. Chapter 15. Shadows of Treachery. The arrival at the Northumbrian court was a stark contrast to the hurried departure from their own kingdom. King Edward, a tall, imposing man with a keen intelligence in his eyes, greeted them with cautious warmth. He listened intently to Gareth's account of the events, examining the evidence, the scroll, the vial of poison, and Elmsworth's testimony, painstakingly transcribed by Isabel during their journey. King Edward was a shrewd ruler, known for his fairness and his strategic mind. He questioned Gareth and Isabel thoroughly, probing for any inconsistencies, any weaknesses in their story. He was not a man to be easily swayed by emotion or sentiment. The Duke of Northwood's treachery is a grave matter, he said, his voice heavy with concern. It threatens not only your kingdom, but mine as well. A destabilized kingdom on my border is a threat to my own people. He paced the room, his brow furrowed in thought. I need proof, he said. Solid, irrefutable proof that the Duke's influence has not spread beyond your borders. I need to be certain that I am not walking into a trap, that I am not allying myself with a kingdom already riddled with corruption. Gareth understood the king's caution. Trust between kingdoms was a fragile thing, easily broken, hard won. Your Majesty, Gareth said, I understand your concerns. I can offer you my word, my honor, but I know that may not be enough. I can only suggest that you send your own spies, your own investigators, to verify our claims. Let them see for themselves the extent of the Duke's treachery. King Edward nodded, his gaze thoughtful. That is a reasonable request, Sir Gareth, he said. And I will do so. But in the meantime, I must ask you both to remain here in Northumbria as my guests. The word guests was carefully chosen, a diplomatic euphemism for what they essentially were. Hostages. It was a standard practice, a way of ensuring cooperation, of preventing any sudden changes of heart. Isabel and Gareth exchanged a look. They understood the implications. They were safe for now, but they were also confined, their freedom curtailed. We understand, Your Majesty, Isabel said, her voice calm and composed. We are grateful for your hospitality, and we will cooperate fully with your investigators. King Edward smiled, a brief, fleeting smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I am glad to hear it, Lady Isabel," he said. "I trust we will have a productive relationship." They were shown to their quarters, comfortable but sparsely furnished rooms within the castle walls. They were treated with courtesy and respect, but they were always aware of the watchful eyes, the ever-present guards. As the days passed, Isabel and Gareth found themselves in a strange limbo, caught between hope and anxiety. They were waiting for King Edward's decision, for the outcome of his investigation. Their fate, the fate of their kingdom, hung in the balance. They spent their time exploring the castle, attending court functions, engaging in polite conversations with the Northumbrian nobles. They were careful to maintain a facade of calm and confidence, hiding their fears, their uncertainties. But beneath the surface, tensions were simmering. They discovered that the Northumbrian court was not as unified as it appeared. There were factions, rivalries, whispers of discontent. Some nobles were sympathetic to their cause, while others were suspicious, even hostile. They learned that the Duke of Northwood had allies in Northumbria, powerful individuals who had benefited from his patronage, who shared his ambition. These shadows of treachery were a constant threat, a reminder that they were not safe, even in this seemingly neutral territory. One evening, as they were walking in the castle gardens, Gareth noticed a figure lurking in the shadows, watching them. He recognized the man, a minor noble who had been particularly inquisitive about their situation. Gareth drew Isabel aside, his voice low and urgent. "We are being watched," he said. "We need to be careful. We cannot trust anyone." Isabel nodded, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of fear. They were surrounded by enemies, both visible and hidden. They were walking a tightrope, their every step fraught with danger. The air itself seemed to hold secrets. Chapter 16. The Unveiling. The sense of unease deepened as the days turned into weeks. Gareth and Isabel felt increasingly isolated, surrounded by a court that seemed both welcoming and hostile. They knew King Edward's spies were diligently working, gathering information, assessing the situation, but the waiting was agonizing. Every whispered conversation, every averted gaze, every subtle gesture felt laden with meaning. One evening, they were summoned to a private audience with King Edward. The king's demeanor was grave, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something Isabel couldn't quite decipher. "I have received reports from my investigators," he said, his voice heavy. "They have confirmed the Duke of Northwood's treachery, his plot to overthrow King Alaric. They have also uncovered evidence of his influence within my own court." Isabel and Gareth exchanged a look of relief. King Edward believed them, but their relief was short-lived. However, the king continued, his gaze shifting to Isabel. "They have also uncovered disturbing information about your past, Lady Isabel." Isabel's heart sank. What had they found? What lies had the Duke of Northwood spread about her? "They say," the king continued, his voice low and measured, "that you are not who you claim to be. That you are not the true daughter of the late Earl of Westmere." Isabel gasped, her face paling. That is a lie," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "I am Isabel of Westmere. I swear it." King Edward held up a hand, silencing her. "I am not accusing you, Lady Isabel," he said, "but I must have proof. My investigators have presented me with evidence. A birthmark, a missing document, a witness who claims to have known the truth." He produced a small, ornate box, placing it on the table between them. "This box," he said, "contains the evidence. I will leave you both to examine it. I will return in 1 hour. I expect you to have an explanation." He left the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Isabel and Gareth stared at the box, their hearts pounding with dread. It was a Pandora's box, filled with secrets that could destroy them. Gareth reached out and opened the box, his hand trembling. Inside, they found a collection of items, a faded miniature portrait of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Isabel, but with a distinct birthmark on her left shoulder, a copy of a birth registry, with Isabel's name conspicuously absent, and a sworn affidavit from an elderly woman claiming to have been a midwife at Westmere, stating that the Earl's true daughter had died in infancy and had been replaced with a peasant child. Isabel stared at the evidence, her mind reeling. It was a carefully constructed fabrication, a web of lies designed to discredit her, to strip her of her title, her identity. But it was so convincing, so detailed it's not true, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It can't be true. Gareth examined the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a warrior, not a scholar, but he had a keen eye for detail, a knack for spotting inconsistencies. This birth registry, he said, pointing to a specific entry. The ink, it's different. It's been altered. He examined the affidavit, his gaze narrowing. This midwife, he said, her name, I recognize it. She was known to be in the Duke of Northwood's employ. He looked at Isabel, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. This is a forgery, Isabel, he said. A clever one, but a forgery nonetheless. The Duke has gone to great lengths to discredit you, but he has made mistakes. Isabel felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. Gareth believed her. He saw through the lies. But how do we prove it? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. The king, he will believe this evidence. Gareth thought for a moment, his mind racing. We need to find the original birth registry, he said. The one that hasn't been altered. It must be somewhere, hidden in the archives of Westmere. But we are in Northumbria, Isabel said. We cannot return to Westmere. It's too dangerous. Gareth smiled, a grim, determined smile. We may not need to, he said. There is another way. A way to expose the truth, to unveil the Duke's treachery once and for all. He had a plan, a daring gamble that would either save them or destroy them. But the unveiling could no longer be put off. It would be their last stand to expose the truth. Chapter 17. Flames of Rebellion. Gareth's plan relied on exploiting the existing tensions within the Northumbrian court. He had learned, through careful observation and discreet inquiries, that a faction of nobles was secretly opposed to King Edward's cautious approach towards the situation in their neighboring kingdom. These nobles, fueled by ambition and a desire for expansion, saw the turmoil in the south as an opportunity to seize land and power. They were sympathetic to the Duke of Northwood, or at least to his goals. Gareth intended to use this faction to his advantage, to sow discord, to create a distraction that would allow him to expose the truth about Isabel and the Duke's treachery. He sought out the leader of this faction, a powerful and influential nobleman named Lord Valerius. He presented himself as a disillusioned supporter of King Alaric, seeking refuge in Northumbria, and hinted at possessing information that could be valuable to Valerius's cause. Valerius, a cunning and ambitious man, was intrigued. He saw Gareth as a potential pawn, a tool to further his own ambitions. He invited Gareth to a secret meeting where he and his fellow conspirators gathered to discuss their plans. Gareth played his part carefully, feigning sympathy for their cause, hinting at the weakness of King Alaric, the vulnerability of his kingdom. He slowly gained their trust, feeding them carefully selected pieces of information, fueling their desire for action. Meanwhile, Isabel used her time to cultivate relationships with the more moderate members of the Northumbrian court, those who were loyal to King Edward and suspicious of Valerius's faction. She used her charm, her intelligence, her genuine concern for the well-being of both kingdoms to win their support. She spoke of the Duke of Northwood's treachery, of his plot to overthrow King Alaric, of the danger he posed to both kingdoms. She presented herself as a victim of his ambition, a woman fighting for her freedom, for her identity, for the stability of her homeland. She gradually built a network of allies, individuals who believed in her innocence, who were willing to stand up for her, to speak out against the lies that had been spread about her. The stage was set. Gareth, working from within the conspiracy, and Isabel, working from outside, were ready to spring their trap. The opportunity came during a grand feast, a lavish event hosted by King Edward to celebrate the continued alliance between the two kingdoms. The great hall was filled with nobles, courtiers, and dignitaries, all dressed in their finest attire. As the feast progressed, Gareth, at a prearranged signal, rose to his feet, his voice ringing out across the hall. "My lords and ladies," he said, "I have a toast to propose. A toast to truth and justice." He raised his goblet, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw the faces of his enemies, the faces of his allies, the faces of those who were undecided. "I have come to Northumbria seeking refuge," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "But I have also come seeking justice. Justice for Lady Isabel of Westmere, a woman who has been falsely accused, unjustly persecuted." He turned to face King Edward, his gaze unwavering. "Your Majesty," he said, "I have presented you with evidence of the Duke of Northwood's treachery. But there is more. There is evidence that has been deliberately concealed, evidence that will expose the truth about Lady Isabel's identity." He produced a small, sealed scroll, the original birth registry of Westmere, which he had managed to obtain through a daring raid on a secret archive maintained by the Duke of Northwood's spies in Northumbria. It was a risky maneuver, but it had been successful. "This scroll," he said, "contains the true record of Lady Isabel's birth. It proves that she is the rightful heir to the title and lands of Westmere. It proves that the evidence presented against her is a forgery, a fabrication designed to discredit her, to strip her of her birthright." A hush fell over the great hall. All eyes were on Gareth, on the scroll, on Isabel. Lord Valerius, realizing that he had been played, rose to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "This is a trick," he shouted. "A lie. Seize him. Seize them both." But before his guards could react, Isabel stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "The truth cannot be silenced," she cried. "The Duke of Northwood is a traitor, a liar, a murderer. He has plotted against his own king. He has sought to destabilize both our kingdoms. He must be stopped." Her words ignited the flames of rebellion. The moderate nobles, those who had been swayed by her sincerity, by her courage, rose to their feet, their swords drawn. They stood with Isabel, with Gareth, against Valerius and his faction. A battle erupted in the great hall, a chaotic clash of steel and will. The feast turned into a battlefield, the celebration into a struggle for power, for justice, for truth. It was a desperate gamble, a fight against overwhelming odds. But the truth, like a wildfire, had been unleashed. Chapter 18. A Test of Loyalty. The fighting in the great hall was fierce and chaotic. Swords clashed, cries of pain and rage echoed through the chamber, and the once pristine floor became stained with blood. Gareth fought with the skill and ferocity of a seasoned warrior, protecting Isabel while striving to reach King Edward, who was surrounded by his loyal guards, watching the unfolding events with a mixture of shock and grim determination. Isabel, though armed with only a small dagger, fought bravely, defending herself against the attacks of Valerius's men. She had never been trained in combat, but her fear was overshadowed by a fierce determination to survive, to protect Gareth, to see justice done. The moderate nobles, those who had rallied to Isabel's side, fought with a righteous fury, their loyalty to King Edward and their belief in Isabel's innocence fueling their actions. They were outnumbered by Valerius's faction, but they fought with a courage and determination that surprised their enemies. King Edward, seeing the tide of the battle turning against Valerius, finally made his move. He ordered his royal guard to intervene, to restore order, to arrest Valerius and his conspirators. The king's intervention was decisive. Valerius's men, seeing their leader falter, their cause lost, began to surrender. The fighting gradually subsided, leaving the great hall in a state of stunned silence. Valerius, defeated and disgraced, was dragged before King Edward, his hands bound. He glared at Gareth and Isabel, his eyes filled with hatred and resentment. You will pay for this," he spat, his voice hoarse. "You have ruined everything." King Edward ignored him, turning his attention to Gareth and Isabel. He looked at them with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. "You have shown great courage and loyalty," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You have exposed a dangerous conspiracy. You have saved my kingdom from a potential civil war. I am in your debt." He turned to his guards. "Release Lady Isabel," he ordered. "She is no longer a prisoner, but a guest of honor. And as for you, Sir Gareth," he added, turning back to Gareth, "once the full truth is made known within my kingdom, You will have my full support against the Duke. Your loyalty will be rewarded." Gareth and Isabel bowed their heads, their hearts filled with relief and gratitude. They had survived. They had won. But the victory was bittersweet. The battle had taken its toll, leaving scars both visible and hidden. As the chaos subsided, Gareth noticed a disturbing absence. Where was the scroll, the original birth registry of Westmere? It had been in his hand when the fighting broke out, but now it was gone. He frantically searched the area, his eyes scanning the floor, the tables, the fallen bodies. But the scroll was nowhere to be found. Isabel saw the panic in his eyes. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "The scroll," Gareth said, his voice strained. "It's gone. The original birth registry, it's missing." Isabel's heart sank. The scroll was their proof, their evidence, their only means of definitively clearing Isabel's name and securing her rightful inheritance. Without it, they were still vulnerable, still at the mercy of the Duke of Northwood's lies. They searched together, desperately, but to no avail. The scroll had vanished, as if swallowed up by the chaos of the battle. Gareth suspected treachery. Someone had taken the scroll, someone who wanted to keep the truth hidden, someone who still supported the Duke of Northwood's cause. He looked around the great hall, his eyes scanning the faces of the remaining nobles, the guards, the servants. Who had taken it? Who was still loyal to the Duke? The test of loyalty was not over. The battle in the great hall had ended, but the war for truth and justice was far from finished. And now, they faced a new challenge, a new mystery. They had to find the scroll, before it was too late. Chapter 19. The Heart's Surrender. The loss of the scroll cast a shadow over their victory. Gareth and Isabel knew that without it, their position remained precarious. While King Edward had declared his support, the missing document meant that whispers and doubts could still linger, especially back in their own kingdom. They spent the following days in a state of heightened alert, searching for any clue, any hint of who might have taken the scroll. Gareth questioned the guards, the servants, even some of the nobles, but his efforts yielded nothing. It was as if the scroll had vanished into thin air. Isabel, despite her own anxiety, tried to remain optimistic. She trusted Gareth, she believed in their cause, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The missing scroll was a constant reminder of their vulnerability, of the enemies who still lurked in the shadows. One evening, as they were walking in the castle gardens, seeking a moment of peace amidst the turmoil, Isabel noticed a small, almost imperceptible trail of dried mud leading away from the great hall towards a less frequented part of the castle grounds. "Gareth," she said, pointing to the trail. "Look. Could this be?" Gareth examined the trail, his eyes narrowing. The mud was of a specific type, found only in a particular area near the castle stables. It was a long shot, but it was a lead. They followed the trail, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. It led them to a small, secluded courtyard, rarely used, overgrown with weeds. In the center of the courtyard was an old well, its stone walls crumbling, its wooden cover rotting. Gareth approached the well cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He listened intently, but heard nothing. He carefully lifted the wooden cover, peering into the darkness. The well was deep, its depths shrouded in shadow. But at the bottom, he saw something of faint glimmer, a reflection of light. He lowered himself into the well, using the crumbling stones as handholds. Isabel watched from above, her heart in her throat, praying for his safety. Gareth reached the bottom, his feet landing on something soft and yielding. He reached down and picked it up. It was a leather pouch, damp and muddy, but intact. He opened it, his heart leaping with excitement. Inside was the scroll, the original birth registry of Westmere. He climbed back out of the well, his face beaming with triumph. "I found it!" he exclaimed, holding up the pouch. "The scroll, it's here." Isabel rushed to him, embracing him tightly, her relief overwhelming. They had found it. They had recovered the proof, the evidence that would clear her name, secure her future. As they examined the scroll, ensuring it was undamaged, they noticed a small, folded piece of parchment tucked inside. It was a note, written in a hurried hand, a hand that Isabel recognized. She unfolded the note, her eyes widening in surprise as she read the words. It was from Lord Elmsworth, the former advisor to King Alaric, whom they had rescued from the dungeons. The note explained that Elmsworth, fearing for the scroll's safety during their escape, had entrusted it to a loyal servant in Northumbria, a man he had known and trusted for many years. The servant, fearing discovery, had hidden the scroll in the well, intending to retrieve it later. But the servant had fallen ill and had been unable to recover the scroll before Gareth and Isabel had discovered its hiding place. The note ended with a plea for forgiveness and a reaffirmation of Elmsworth's loyalty to Isabel and to the true king. Isabel and Gareth exchanged a look of relief and gratitude. Elmsworth, even in his weakened state, had continued to fight for them, to protect them. With the scroll recovered, their position was secure. They presented it to King Edward, who was both relieved and impressed by their resourcefulness. He reaffirmed his support, promising to send a contingent of his own troops to assist King Alaric in reclaiming his throne and suppressing any remaining resistance. As they prepared to return to their own kingdom, Gareth and Isabel found themselves standing on the precipice of a new beginning. The trials they had faced, the dangers they had overcome, had forged a bond between them that was stronger than any oath, any obligation. Gareth took Isabel's hands in his amber eyes filled with a love that transcended words. "Isabel," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "I love you. Not as a knight loves his lady, not as a protector loves his charge, but as a man loves a woman. With all my heart, with all my soul." Isabel's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of overwhelming love. "And I love you, Gareth," she whispered. "With all my heart, with all my soul." He leaned down and kissed her, a long, tender, passionate kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their future. It was a heart's surrender, a final, irrevocable giving of themselves to each other. The trials were not over, but they would face them together, their love a beacon of hope in a world still shrouded in uncertainty. Chapter 20. A Kingdom Reclaimed. The return to their kingdom was both triumphant and somber. The news of the Duke of Northwood's treachery and King Edward's support had preceded them, spreading like wildfire through the land. The people, weary of the Duke's oppressive rule and yearning for the return of their rightful king, welcomed Gareth and Isabel as heroes. King Alaric, weakened but recovering from the effects of the poison, greeted them with open arms, his gratitude immeasurable. He had been humbled by the events, his faith in his own judgment shaken, but he was determined to rebuild his kingdom, to restore justice and order. The remaining loyalists of the Duke of Northwood, scattered and disorganized, were quickly rounded up and brought to justice. The trials were swift and decisive, the evidence against them overwhelming. The Duke himself, stripped of his titles and lands, was imprisoned, awaiting the king's final judgment. Isabel, with the original birth registry in hand, was formally recognized as the rightful heir to Westmere. Her lands and titles were restored, her name cleared of all suspicion. She was no longer a fugitive, a hunted woman, but a powerful noble, a trusted advisor to the king. Gareth, for his unwavering loyalty and courage, was elevated to the position of Lord Commander of the King's Guard, a position of great honor and responsibility. He was entrusted with the task of rebuilding the kingdom's defenses, of ensuring the safety and security of the realm. The kingdom slowly began to heal, the wounds of treachery and betrayal gradually fading. The people, inspired by the courage of Gareth and Isabel and by the king's renewed commitment to justice, worked together to rebuild their lives, their communities, their nation. But the scars remained, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace, the ever-present threat of ambition and greed. Gareth and Isabel, aware of the challenges that still lay ahead, dedicated themselves to serving their kingdom, to protecting their people, to building a better future. One evening, as they stood together on the ramparts of Westmere Castle, overlooking the land they had fought so hard to reclaim, Gareth turned to Isabel, his eyes filled with love and admiration. "We have come a long way, my lady," he said, his voice soft and tender. "From fugitive and hunter, to allies and lovers, to what now?" Isabel smiled, her heart filled with a joy that surpassed all understanding. "Now," she said, "we build our future. Together." He took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "I have a proposal," he said, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "A proposal that requires no secret passages, no hidden chambers, no daring escapes." He knelt before her, his gaze unwavering. "Isabel of Westmere," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Will you share my life, my home, my heart, for all the days to come?" Isabel's eyes filled with tears, tears of pure, unadulterated happiness. She reached out and gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines etched by hardship and courage. "Yes, Gareth," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you. I will share your life, your home, your heart, forever." He rose to his feet, embracing her tightly, his lips finding hers in a kiss that sealed their vows, their commitment, their eternal love. It was a moment of perfect happiness, a culmination of their journey, a promise of a future filled with hope, with love, with peace. A kingdom had been reclaimed, not just through force of arms, but through the strength of their bond, the unwavering power of their love. The sun was starting to set down. They stood together, silhouetted against the setting sun, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Epilogue. Years passed, and the kingdom prospered under the just and wise rule of King Alaric, guided by the counsel of Lady Isabel and the steadfast protection of Lord Gareth. The wounds of the past healed, leaving behind scars that served as reminders of the struggles they had overcome, the lessons they had learned. Isabel and Gareth were married in a grand ceremony, attended by nobles and commoners alike, a celebration of their love, their courage, their unwavering commitment to their kingdom. They ruled Westmere together, their love a source of strength and inspiration to their people. They were blessed with children, a son and a daughter, who inherited their parents' courage, their intelligence, their unwavering sense of justice. The children grew up hearing tales of their parents' adventures, of the dark days of treachery and rebellion, of the triumph of good over evil. Lord Elmsworth, though frail and weakened by his imprisonment, recovered enough to serve as a trusted advisor to Isabel and Gareth, his wisdom and experience invaluable in the rebuilding of the kingdom. He lived out his remaining years in peace and comfort, surrounded by friends and grateful subjects. The Duke of Northwood remained imprisoned, his ambitions thwarted, his power broken. He became a forgotten figure, a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrosive power of treachery. King Alaric, a changed man, ruled with a newfound humility and wisdom. He never forgot the lessons he had learned, the debt he owed to Gareth and Isabel. He remained a close friend and ally, their bond forged in the fires of adversity. And so, the kingdom flourished, a testament to the power of love, of loyalty, of courage in the face of adversity. Isabel and Gareth, their names forever intertwined in the annals of their land, lived out their days in happiness and contentment, their love a beacon of hope, a symbol of the enduring strength of the human spirit. Their story became a legend, whispered around hearth fires and sung by minstrels, a tale of a hunter and a fugitive who found love and redemption in a world consumed by darkness. A tale of a kingdom reclaimed, a love that endured, a future forged in the fires of adversity. Their names, forever etched in the chronicles of time.